So let's take a look at the four who entered into Pardes. And again, Pardes, we're going to translate it as the mystery. It also stands for the four levels of the Torah, which the mysterious one, the sod, the secret, is the last. But it means, obviously, that they entered into all realms, most notably the secrets of the Torah. So I'll read to you the story. The rabbis taught. Four went into this mystery, the Pardes, and the four are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Rabbi Akiva, and Elisha ben Avuya. So let's talk a moment about who these four people were, or should I first just tell the story? Basically, they go into some mystical realm, and it's a perilous journey. There's something dangerous awaiting them, and terrifying, and also awesomely amazing. Maybe even God. Maybe that's what it was, that they embarked on a quest to see God. And Rabbi Akiva knew that there was going to be something that was going to be potentially devastating, and he warned them, but none of them were able to go in and come out the way they were and better. They all had some type of mishap or tragedy, with the one exception of Rabbi Akiva. So there's a lot of details here, so we're going to be covering many of them, whatever we can do in under an hour. But let's talk a little bit about the history of these four men, with emphasis on who Rabbi Akiva was and who Elisha ben Avuya was. So Ben Azai was a bachelor. He never married, or if he did marry, it was for like one night thing, like it didn't work. So he said he's supposed to have said, "What should I do? My soul desires Torah," meaning his love for Torah was so intense he didn't have the ability to share his love with a woman because his whole life was Torah. Again, this is similar to the concept of the Talmud and the Zohar when they reference the death of Nadav and Avihu. One of the many things that's mentioned as an issue for them is that they were not married. So again, in this story, it just kind of repeats itself. He ends up dying because he, according to one opinion brought down in Rashi, he actually saw God, or he saw the Shekhinah, he saw the divine presence, which some of the commentaries have a problem with, because that would make him, in their words, greater than Moses. Not that that would make him greater than Moses, but Moses couldn't see God and live. The fact is, maybe he could have seen God, but he would have died. So it doesn't make him greater than Moses. It just meant he did something Moses knew not to do. That's a little bit about Ben Azai. Ben Zoma, right? We know a little bit about Ben Zoma because we all mention him in the Passover story in the Haggadah, where Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "I'm like 70 years old, and I never could prove the mitzvah to recount the Exodus from Egypt that night until Ad Shadarsha Ben Zoma, until Ben Zoma expounded on the verse." And the Haggadah is quoting the Talmud. So Ben Zoma, we're going to learn a little bit about in terms of he had what we would probably call today maybe a breakdown. He had some type of psychic, not psyche, like a mental meltdown that impaired his regular mind functioning, and it was related to something that overwhelmed him, that he saw more than he could process, more than he could see, and the rest of his life, people would be wondering about him, like asking him questions, trying to assess where he stood. Was he still okay? Meaning, even though he wasn't okay, he still stayed within the fold, so to speak. He might have went, as we call, he might have went crazy, but he didn't go completely off the path, whatever that means. The Gemara will use certain questions that he was asked and interactions he had with other rabbis to both try to assess where he stood, as well as to like kind of glean some insight from what he said as to perhaps something that he had encountered, that he had learned in his experience. The other two are the famous Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva we know well because he was the teacher of 24,000 students who died tragically, and then he rebuilt with just 5 students or so, they say, one of which was Rabbi Meir, and through Rabbi Meir, the Torah was basically remembered and transmitted. The other interesting thing is that it wasn't just Rabbi Meir that studied directly from Rabbi Akiva, but Elisha ben Avuya, the other sage, was also both a student of Rabbi Akiva and also the teacher of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is the main transmitter of Rabbi Akiva's teachings, and his other primary teacher, along with Rabbi Akiva, maybe even more than Rabbi Akiva, was Elisha ben Avuya. It doesn't mean that most of the things he learned were from Elisha ben Avuya, meaning the Elisha ben Avuya's opinion. Elisha ben Avuya might have been a transmitter of earlier teachings of Rabbi Akiva that Rabbi Meir didn't hear directly or wasn't certain about. So those 3, Rabbi Akiva, Elisha ben Avuya, and the student of Elisha ben Avuya and Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, are absolutely essential to the transmission of all of the Mishnah, the Sifra, the Sifri, the very important Midrashic teachings. These are very important. The students of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Meir himself, very important here. So Rabbi Akiva, we know, was a Baal Tshuva. We also know that he was important in setting up the law, so much so that when he was involved in Ma'aseh Merkava, some of his contemporaries said, why are you doing this? Just go back to learning halachot. Go back to the Shulchan Aruch of your day. Meaning, like, why are you even involved in this? The answer, we'll see, is very important. We'll get to that later. And then the fourth and final, a little bit about the history. We'll talk more about the history of Elisha ben Avuya. The Talmud in the Bavli, and particularly the Yerushalmi, much of which is brought down in Tosfos on 15. Tosfos Divrei Hamasel Shuvu Banim Shovivim, a big Tosfos on 15a. We're studying Chagiga. most of what we're studying today is at the bottom of 14b and 15a, 15b in Chagiga, the second chapter of Chagiga in the Talmud. So in that Tosfos, he quotes the Yerushalmi extensively, in which the father of Elisha ben Avuya wasn't particularly a scholar, but he invited a number of rabbis, including Rabbi Yoshua, to his son's circumcision. And the rabbis were sitting and they weren't really participating, they were studying. And they must have been studying something mystical because a heavenly fire descended around them. Elisha ben Avuya's father didn't understand the nature of the fire. He was nervous they were going to burn the hall down. So he confronted them and they said, no, this is not a fire that's going to destroy anyone. This is there's a holy fire. And then he saw how everybody was honoring them. So he said, okay, I want my son to be a Torah scholar, just like these great people. But his motive was that his son should be honorable and honored and given recognition. And that was seen as the beginning of ego that infected somehow Elisha ben Avuya's future. A number of other stories, including in our Talmud, where the Talmud says that the reason why he was kind of predisposed to go off, because he became a heretic, is that he always had a Greek song on his lips, and when he would get up from the study hall, Greek pamphlets, probably philosophy, maybe poetry, would fall out of his lap. In other words, he was secretly a big admirer of Greek culture and philosophy. He was reading them. So that already created a crack, so to speak, in his armor. So that's a little bit about the history. There's more there, but that's a little bit for now. There's another part of it is that he had witnessed certain tragedies that might have led him to have questions of divine reward and punishment. He witnessed, according to the Gemara in Ksuvos, he witnessed a child who was listening to his father to chase away the mother bird before getting the baby bird or the chicks. And while he was doing this mitzvah, the two mitzvah that the Torah says, if you do them, you get a long life, he fell from the ladder and he died. So again, he was having issues of reconciling God as, simply giving reward based on a person's, keeping the mitzvot. A simplistic view that would be altered by none other than his grandson, a rabbi named Yaakov, who was the son of Elisha ben Avuya's daughter, who we're also going to learn about. Okay, let's continue. So what happens is that Ben Zoma looks, okay, let me first read what Rabbi Akiva warns them. Rabbi Akiva says, when you enter into the Pardes, you're going to reach at some point pure marble stones. And don't say water. Like now we know that's probably a reference to, in Genesis, there's the idea of the water of the firmament, the water of heaven and the water on earth were one, and then God divided the upper water from the lower water, right? And one water became like the seas, and the other water became either a mystical element or something in the sky, if you want to understand it physically. Don't say that there's water below, there's water above. That would probably mean that there's some kind of point that they would reach in which they could sense some sort of dualism or some sort of division. We could talk about what that dualism would be, different opinions of what it was. And why is it so important to not say water, water? Now, I would think, according to the commentaries, because it borders on heresy, it borders on belief in more than one divine power, one God. But yet that's not a verse that Rabbi Akiva quotes, or that the Talmud quotes. Instead, it quotes a verse that says, somebody who's a liar can't be in front of my eyes. Okay, I mean, maybe if you're going to see that level of divine presence, you can't lie in that presence. But it doesn't look like it's idolatry per se. Now, we could also talk about idolatry not on a absolute level, but on a continuum, the beginning of what can turn into idolatry once it's progressed, which is the view of many rabbis in general, is that the subtle forms of idolatry are not yet necessarily halachic idolatry. They're just misunderstandings that are subtle, and then eventually they develop into idolatry. So what happens is that Ben Azai is the first to go in, at least in the story. Again, the chronology here is just either because that's the order, or just because we pick one. And Ben Azai, he looked up and he died. Okay. Now, what did he see? So Rashi says he looked at the Shekhinah, he looked at the divine presence. Okay. And some of the commentaries say, no, that would make him higher than Moses. So he didn't actually look at the Shekhinah. So that's a debate. So that's Ben Azai. And there's a verse on each one of these sages. The verse about him is, it's difficult in the eyes of God, the death of his devout ones. So there's implication here is that he's devout. He's a chassid. He's a chassid. But yeah, and it's difficult for God. And there's an idea here that there's some people who their death is a form of atonement. Again, similar to why we read Achrimot Shnei Bnei Aaron, the death of the sons of Aaron, on Yom Kippur, because it's considered, the death of tzaddikim is considered a mizbeach kapara, it's considered an altar of atonement. Then Ben Zoma, he looked and he became unwell mentally. And on him, there's a verse that says, there's honey, when you eat too much, only eat enough, because if you eat too much, you'll vomit it out. Which means he basically overdosed on holiness. And I'm going to explain all these things as we go on. Acher Kitzas Benetiyot, he chopped down the saplings of the orchard. Again, you have to remember, it's a great metaphor. The orchard has trees, and the trees have roots that go into the ground. And him cutting down the saplings means he did something to the tree. What do we know is a tree? The tree of knowledge and the tree of life. So there's some reference here to trees, probably to that. Now, what is it that they saw? What is it that they did to get into this Pardes? What did they do? So if you remember, the last time we met was the introduction, the overall introduction. It's on YouTube now. I really think it's actually one of, I don't like to say, oh, this thing I did was really good, but that thing I did, it was good. So you should, watch it, even though we did it already. And if you haven't, it's worth the watch. So it's an introduction to Merkava in the Talmud. And the point I made there is there's 7 ways to read the entire section that we studied about last time and this time. And I'll review it in a minute, and instead of a whole class. The first is that the Ma'aseh Merkava is a series of brisos. So it's a hidden esoteric knowledge that was transmitted as a teaching. We lost them, basically, and we can't find them. So they actually were taught it, and then they repeated it, and I guess whatever happened, that knowledge of those teachings is what they delved into, and something happened to them, either because it was intellectually, they were unable to, other than Rabbi Akiva, they were unable to process it correctly. They misunderstood something. That's one thing. The second thing, and again, the teachings included divine names, so it could have induced something. The second way of seeing it is it's all like, it's the equivalent of magic. They did some incantations that put them in an outer body experience, and they flew, either physically flew, or it was as if they had an outer body experience, like they were flying, even if they didn't actually fly. The third opinion, which is Maimonides, is that they were exploring the nature of the universe. They were scientists. They were trying to reconcile Torah with science, Torah and philosophy. And that approach is a little bit taken up by the author of Like a Driven Leaf, Rabbi Milton Steinberg, particularly when it comes to Elisha ben Avuya. The number 4 is the idea that's proposed by Rachel Elior, who's an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they were entering into the realm of the Dead Sea Scrolls, basically into the traditions that the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the Bnei Tzadok, who were a priestly clan, who had broken away from actual control of the temple when they were replaced by the Maccabees, they created a series of understanding that the divine temple now no longer had to be the physical temple, but it manifested in heaven. So they recreated a temple in the sky. So what we would call Hechalot literature is really temple literature, spiritual temple literature. So they were entering into that state through that understanding. And there was kind of a competing school of Judaism that the rabbis felt was wrong overall, but it had some value, had some mystical component that was based on truth, and they would reveal some part of it and conceal the rest of it to a very limited audience. And somehow one person died, one person went crazy, one person went off, possibly became under the influence of that group, and the other, Rabbi Akiva, took what he got something out of that experience, and incorporated it into rabbinic Judaism. Number 5 is that it's a particular understanding of what the Zohar and the Kabbalists, when they deal with ideas of like the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, or later the broken vessels, it's delving very deep into very big secrets of the Kabbalah, and there's a potential to go crazy. There's a potential to die as either a punishment or as you're not ready, you're not on the level. And that's what some people today, they don't want to study Kabbalah. They think they're going to go crazy. Again, you don't really go crazy from Kabbalah. You go crazy because whatever the reason is, it's not really Kabbalah that's doing it. But I guess when some people ask too many questions and they have unsatisfactory answers, that could contribute to their meltdown. Okay. And that's different than Kabbalah Ma'asiyot, the number 2, which is Kabbalah action. It's Kabbalah as we know it in the Zohar, and theosophical Kabbalah. Number 6, it's really part of the Agadic tradition. There's a big Agadic tradition in the Talmud that's mysterious, and that talks a lot about angels and talks about a lot about mystical experiences that are kind of not really how Judaism developed. Judaism veered away from a lot of these things for a lot of reasons. took some parts of them. I'm not saying it threw them all aside, but only in a limited way. And number 7 is it's not really any one thing. We shouldn't make any of these 6 earlier categories. We don't really know. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Okay. So that's kind of based on how you see that, that would answer of what it is that they did, and what it is that they saw. So for example, if you said it was number 4, which is that they basically got familiar with the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that would include learning about Enoch, Enosh, Hanoch, as we call him, who was supposedly turned into the angel Metatron, which is what Elisha ben Avuya experienced when he saw the angel Metatron sitting and writing, because that's what he was. Metatron and Hanoch were known for being scribes, the same being that transformed into an angel, for being a scribe, for being the writer of the calendar and a ledger and so on and so forth. So that's what was going on. They were each kind of like Rabbi Akiva was looking and saying, well, these people have certain kind of traditions that we know some part of it is true and some part of it is false. And I'm going to extract the truth out of it without falling for the falsehoods. And that's what they were each doing. Okay. If it is physics, what they were basically doing is they were trying to reconcile Judaism with the Greek philosophy of the time, which would make sense, for example, why I would say that Elisha ben Avuya was always singing Greek tunes and reading Greek books, is because it's one thing if you, as a rabbi, try to read the competition and reconcile it or respond to it. But if you already are just on your own, singing their songs, you're culturally influenced by them, then you're not equipped to answer them. You're too weak. So that would be the answer, is that it was Greek, which is now in the hands of the Romans. The Romans took the place of the Greeks as the kind of leading philosophers, so to speak. Okay. Everybody pretty clear on what's going on so far?
We're still in the same points, 14b, right?
Yeah, we're still in 14b. I'm covering a lot of the story that is on 15. Some of the things I'm saying, I already went through this, so I know what's happening ahead. So I'm not necessarily going to read it all inside. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, we're still on 14b.
You're doing great.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Coming from you, I appreciate it. Okay, anyone else?
I've got a question.
Just one thing. Sorry, am I interrupting somebody?
You can go
So
ahead.
why don't we go? Zeb, go first, and then Rabbi Yossi.
So there's the statement that these 4 entered Pardes. Do you think it's suggesting that the 4 of them, they went in together, like Rabbi Akiva turned to them and gave them this warning about Mayim, that it was something that they undertook as a joint effort? Or is it just saying 4 people in history made it this far, these were the 4, and like they didn't necessarily do it as a group?
Well, can I suggest that we don't know the answer, but let me suggest that based on your kind of reading of the text, that Rabbi Akiva advised them that they were going in, if not literally at the same time, the same day, the same table, the same room, that they were they were well aware of each other's engagement. So they were going in the same period. Even if they weren't literally sitting around the same living room, you know.
I thought that was the point, Rabbi, that they were sitting around the same living room. That they basically they fasted. Can you hear me?
Yes, David.
Very.
They fasted for a set number of days, like 4 days, right? And but with their heads between their knees. And
Later on, intricate developments that required many days of fasting and many other specific techniques that we could read back that they knew it, if you know, and they did all those things. They did it together. Again, it's kind of open-ended here. They did something together. How much of it together? Were they literally in the same room? Yeah, there are some traditions that they literally all, did this as a group, but you don't need to read it quite that way. You can read it as they were 4 people engaged in a similar passion in the same period that were in communication with each other. You could read it either way.
I like to think, Rabbi, that they projected that they were all together on earth and they projected their souls up. They had such control over their own minds that they projected themselves up into some astral plane, and that's where they met and that's where they began their journey together.
That's cool. Meaning they could have been sitting, one in Manhattan and one in Tel Aviv, and one in Jerusalem, one in Bnei Brak.
Well, this was 2,000 years before Zoom.
Yeah, then they met. Okay, that's good. That's good. Anyway, let's get to Rabbi Yossi.
Yeah, about the, excuse me, about the Acher and the, about the Acher and cutting of the shoots. I've heard that it's because that is an allusion, at least later, it's understood that maybe that meant he separated the spirot.
Yeah, I mean, yes. When we get to, I'll address that. I may do one more thing before I get that. We'll talk about that because that could be like the Zohar basically says pretty much that, So correct. And again, depending on how you approach this, there's different ways to approach the whole story, or meaning when you study Talmud in general, you could study with kind of a preset way of how you learn. Like you learn that they all knew everything, and therefore if there's a contradiction in different places in the Talmud, it's your job to reconcile it, because obviously there's an answer, you just need to find it. Or you could learn that they didn't know what every other rabbi said, and there's arguments, and we assume they're arguing, even if sometimes it seems like the halacha is arguing with the halacha.
Right.
Right. So the same thing when it comes to this. There's different ways of going about, like, what did they know what we would now call the Zohar, right? Did they know that or something like it? And was that what the argument was about in terms of how to understand got the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge? So I'll get there in a moment. Because that's kind of what is it that they saw, right? What did they see? So we mentioned before that there was an argument whether they actually traveled somewhere or they felt like they traveled. I mean, it's kind of a crazy idea of like that they actually went somewhere physically. Like, to me, that's fascinating. It's to say that because that's a corporeal view of spirituality. What we call spirituality today, we know is like everywhere, but not a place you have to go to physically with a spaceship. So to say that they actually went into heaven physically is kind of, what is it that they are talking about? Meaning, is heaven a place, right? I mean, that's not how I understood heaven, but maybe they did understand heaven as they had a whole different understanding of the cosmos than we do. Okay, so that's one thing, where they went, and what they saw what do they see exactly? So from the Hechalot literature and Merkava literature, they would enter into these divine rooms that definitely have a spatial element to it, whether it was a metaphor or not. Again, the same argument. Either it was as if they experienced these dimensions that were like tremendously big beyond what we can imagine, or they actually were big. Actually, there is some kind of space that's a mystical space, but nevertheless a space. So the same debate would continue. Well, once we say they're traveling, or it's like they're traveling, that same debate would define what are we talking about when we talk about these mystical hechalot, these chambers, these temples, so to speak. And if you're interested in that, grab the hechalot literature. Take a look at there's various volumes of work that are, I wouldn't call them midrashics. They're just like they're a standalone thing. They kind of fit in a little bit into here. They're supposedly based on this story, but it's its own genre. It's its own part of Jewish literature, Jewish Torah, for lack of a better word. It is Torah, but it's really unlike almost anything else that you're going to find. So that could be, read up on that. That could be what it is that they were experiencing and seeing. Or, as we said before, they could have been seeing any of the 7 ways. They could have been saying, let's go to Yossi, to Rabbi Yossi, said that they made a division in the sphere, which is, let's take a look at the Zohar here. So there's a lot of Zohar in this, but I'm just going to, I want to share one Zohar with you. And it's in Bereshis. I think it's on 29, if I'm not mistaken, 29a of the Zohar. I don't have it in front of me, but I looked at it this morning. So what the Zohar says is, everybody knows that there was the tree of knowledge and there was the tree of life. So let's say you know that the tree of life is eternal. You know that the tree of life is holy. You know that the tree of life is connected to the divine. But when it comes to the tree of knowledge, it's not eternal per se. It's not holy per se. And it's not connected to life. It's connected to knowledge. Knowledge, another word for knowledge is tov vera, which means ability to choose. Is that ability to choose, which is then translated into people actually doing evil, something that exists that's as real of an entity as the divine tree of life? In other words, maybe there's 2 different trees, there's 2 different realities. Some people, tzaddikim perhaps, are living in this divine realm of the tree of life. Others who are not in that level are simply in the tree of knowledge, and they have to deal not just with death in the physical world, but with evil. In other words, perhaps some people don't have free choice, or the free choice, that conundrum that Maimonides asks, how could God know what's happening, and at the same time that we have free choice? That could be the question, which is reconciled by saying, God doesn't know, or it doesn't, I'm not concerned. I believe in free choice, and therefore there's a separation between the all-knowing God, the tree of life God, and my life, which is tree, which I can choose to do what I want, good or bad. So if you're faced with that conundrum and you make a division and say there's 2 realities, then I'll tell you my mind. If you say that on that level, you might be tempted to say it. You're saying a falsehood. It may, now the paradox is that it may seem like that. You may not have a better explanation, but don't say it. You have this thing, all these like fantasy stories about, it's a Reb Nachman story, or it's a story of Harry Potter. When you go into this room, there's going to be the scary ogre. Do not say, how come you only have one eye? Because if you do, he's going to lose it and you'll never get out of there. So it's almost like this thing you can't say. You're going to get up into heaven. You're going to see something that looks like there may be a division between the higher water and the lower water, meaning there's the spiritual reality, what the Zohar calls like the makifim, the surrounding, the transcendent, and then there's the lower, which is where there's divine immanence, but there's also the emptiness, the void. Don't say they're 2 separate realms, and the realm of the separate is as real as the realm of the divine transcendence. Don't make that mistake. So that, yeah, Rabbi Yossi, you hear what I'm saying? That's
Yep,
basically
yep, I hear you.
that's what it is. Let's talk about psychology now. Let's move on to psychology, and in particular, let's use the Ishbitzer and his student Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. If you want to understand the story, according to the Ishbitzer, let's take a look, for example, at what happens with Ben Zoma. After Ben Zoma, the Talmud continues and says, Rabbi Akiva Yatz B'Shalom. Rabbi Akiva went in peace and he exited in peace. And then it says they asked Ben Zoma, what is the law regarding neutering a dog? Strange thing to ask somebody after he just, barely made it out alive and had a mental breakdown, and you're asking him, can you neuter a dog? And the verse says, he responds, Ben Zoma responds, one animal has a bruise in that area shall not be offered to God, nor shall you do so in your land. And it's talking about what animals are not going to be offered to the altar. These words should be taught as follows. Whatever you cannot do in your land, meaning an animal that's in your land, even a dog, you can't do the prohibition of neutering. Now, if you have a dog, you need to neuter it. There are halachic ways. It's like you sell your chametz to the dog. I'm sorry, you sell your chametz to the non-Jew. You sell your dog to non-Jew. There are people who do. There are rabbinic loopholes to do things like that. But this is a strange question. And then they ask another question, which is, a virgin becomes pregnant, can she marry the Kohen Gadol? Because generally speaking, the Kohen Gadol has to marry a virgin, but here she's claiming to be a virgin. Now, and there's a little back and forth. Do we say, maybe Shmuel says it's possible for a woman to have slept with a man, still have her signs of virginity, but is actually not really a virgin? Do we worry about that or not? And he answers a really strange answer, Ben Zoma. He says, no, we don't worry about Shmuel. It's not so common. Rather, it's possible that the woman became pregnant because of semen in a bathtub. So right away, the second thing is reminiscent of, who cares about a virgin birth? Nobody in Judaism, right? It's not a thing. It's Christianity. It's a reference to Christianity. They're asking something about Christianity. The dog also might be something about Christianity. That's how I believe the Ben Yehoyada understands the thing about the dog. So what they're basically trying to assess is how is this guy's faith, basically. But here's that's a simple reading of it. Here's how the Ishbitzer explains it. When you go really high, one of two things can happen to you. One thing is that you look at less important things with even more disdain. So somebody who went and saw what they saw, like Ben Zoma saw, perhaps a dog to them, a dog is like Rashi points out, the Mechir Kelev, you can't if somebody sold a sheep for a dog, you can't use that sheep as a sheep to go to the Mizbeach, the altar, because the association with a dog is enough to end its potential position to the holy. So the dog, for whatever reason, represents chutzpah, represents something not so good always, although sometimes it has good qualities, but also has not good qualities. So therefore, the question is, something like a dog, maybe the mitzvah of not neutering your animal doesn't even apply to it. In other words, there has to be a certain high level to have the mitzvah associated with it. And then Zoma says, no. Anything in your land, doesn't matter that it's a dog. Which could also mean a metaphor, like the Ben Yehoyada points out, a metaphor with Christianity, like it doesn't affect the physical world. Then the thing about the virgin who gives birth, what that represents is the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is very exalted, but maybe it's exploring, like, is the Kohen Gadol so exalted that he really has no ability? We worship him almost, And he's not like a human anymore. And that's really the question, which might be, is the Kohen Gadol have any possibility to be with somebody who may on some level have gotten pregnant somehow with someone that we don't know? Is the Kohen Gadol so saintly that there's just, we don't find a way for them in this situation? And the answer is no, we're not nervous about Shmuel. Even the Kohen Gadol is still a human being, and we still make some type of way of being able to allow this particular case. What does that have to do with psychology? What it has to do is that when there's an experience like the 4 that went into Pardes, there's a psychological teaching that we draw out from each one of their experiences. So, for example, we learn about the story of Nadav and Avihu. Why is it that Nadav and Avihu died? Because they offered a strange fire. Perhaps what it means is that they didn't take the time to integrate the spiritual experience with the physical experience. In other words, what is Judaism if not integration, if not trying to find a mechanism that even the most spiritual things has a mitzvah associated with? So that's a very important thing that that's coming out here, that's manifesting here. Now, we already talked about a little bit about Milton Steinberg, who wrote a beautiful historical novel, Like a Driven Leaf. It's not all accurate, but one of the things he mentions is the stories of Elisha ben Avuya getting enamored with Greek philosophy and trying to write a book, a novel or a book that contains all of wisdom in it. So he was definitely searching for something. And he also witnessed tragedy that led him to question how there could be a benevolent God that allows people who are listening to the mitzvot to perish. So again, the same idea here. Strictly speaking, somebody reads the Bible. It's very goal-oriented and it's very reward and punishment oriented on a simplistic level. That's why it would have to be his grandson that says that when it says promises a long life, it's not talking about a long life. It's talking about in the world to come. We reinterpret those verses. They're no longer meant to be literal. Maybe they were never meant to be literal, but they're never. From that point onward, the Talmud even says, had the teaching of Rabbi Yaakov been taught to Elisha ben Avuya, he wouldn't have gone and become a heretic. So some of the points in the historical novel are taken from different parts of the Talmud, taken like from the Yerushalmi, that's mentioned in the Tosfos, taken from the Gemara in Ksubos. I believe it's Chaf Tes Amud Beis 29b. That's probably why I said the Zohar is also 29. I'm getting them confused. The Zohar is probably 27. Now let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls for a moment. We know that the Gemara continues and says the following thing. I'll skip a couple lines. The rabbis taught another story about Elisha, about Ben Zoma, and then it says, and that's about this idea of the mistake of saying that there's 2 separate levels of the higher water and the lower water. That's the Talmud records that, and the rabbis say no, they're just a hair breadth, or like 2 cups or garments on one another. And then the Gemara says that Acher Katas Benetios. It's about a third of the way down of the page. I'm skipping a little bit. He chopped down the saplings, and the verse says in him, let your mouth not bring guilt upon your flesh. So what is it that he saw? What did he see that led him to heresy? So he saw Metatron that was sitting with permission and recording the good things that Israel had done, the mitzvot. But Acha was bothered by this because he had a tradition that in heaven there is no sitting and no competition, nor the back of a head. So he said, maybe God forbid, if Metatron is sitting, it's because there are 2 authorities. Metatron is like a co-equal with God. And because of that, he became a heretic. So according to the way Rachel Elior understands the story, and you could read her book on the Heavenly Temple. The way she understands it is that the Pardes that they were entering to some degree was associated with the B'nai Tzadok, what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, the people who are involved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. According to her, there's controversy about who exactly were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, who never stopped writing what the rabbis called Torah Sheb'chsav, the written Torah. They ended it and they began part of the Torah Sheb'al Peh. But the B'nai Tzadok continued writing and continue to consider their writings like the written Torah, which the rabbis obviously took issue with. There were a number of very significant differences between these two groups. They're both Jewish groups. They both fought for dominance in political, religious, and temple life, but they had different, very different views of how the calendar was set up, which then affected the holidays, and a number of other factors, including how to view the rabbinic tradition, which they didn't necessarily see the rabbinic tradition as the correct tradition. So in their literature, it talks about the book. They have, I think, 3 books of Chanoch. So Chanoch turns into Metatron at some point, and is and that's who Elisha ben Avuya is seeing this. Maybe he didn't just read their literature. Maybe he went up in a mystical thing, and then he was familiar with the literature, and he sees something that he only saw from their literature appear in his vision, which bothered him to no end, and he decided, whoa, I can't deal with this. So we don't know how to read it, but there's something about him becoming familiar, and perhaps the other 3 as well, becoming familiar with the competition's mystical tradition. They had a mystical tradition. Perhaps the rabbis didn't have the mystical tradition because they were more focused on the halacha, and they had to kind of say, well, we're going to go to them. We're going to enter into a little bit of their teachings with the caveat that most of it is not kosher, and we don't pay any attention to their calendar or to their ignorance or hatred of rabbinic tradition and so on. But we're going to look at this mystical thing they teach. Boom. Even that is dangerous. Look what happens to Elisha ben Avuya. That's why they give Metatron as a punishment 60 blows of fire. It's very hard to understand. How do you punish an angel? He sat with permission. The simple answer the commentaries say is because of him, it led to the downfall of Elisha ben Avuya. Okay, number 11, 12, 13 here are 3 additional ways to read what happened exactly to Elisha ben Avuya. He just liked the reading of Milton Steinberg. He became basically enamored with Greek philosophy. That's one way. Maybe he became a Christian. That's a hard one. I don't know anyone serious who says that. Not that he became a Christian, but he became, I think Christianity has 2 components in it. There were Jewish Christians who were religious, and then there were Roman Christians who were not religious in the sense of Judaically. They were not Jewish at all. They didn't pretend to be Jewish. They were Christians. They through Paul and everything else, it became a non-Jewish religion. So perhaps already on some subtle level, not so much the Jesus aspect, but the kind of, let's be a citizen. You have to ask yourself a question. Why did Constantine adopt Christianity and leave Judaism? What was appealing? Because it was
Universal.
What?
Universal.
So the universalism is what Elisha ben Avuya became. He's like, I'm not interested in Judaism. It's too parochial. It's too whatever. So that's one way. And then what's the reaction to that?
Right, Rabbi, you can't say that Constantine left Judaism. Constantine was never a Jew.
Oh, of course, but he took the part of Christianity that left the Judaism out of it.
Yeah.
Meaning not that he himself was Jewish.
Yeah, but that was already worked out through Peter and Paul.
Correct. But why was it so adoptable that somebody like Constantine would do it? Constantine didn't invent it. Constantine put the Roman Empire behind it, but it already was there waiting for the take. He wasn't an idiot, is what I'm saying. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't just some vision of the cross, as they say, which may or may not have happened. Of course, he's going to claim that happened, of course. But why? Because of what I just said, because it was universal. It was already being made universal. And that's how it came to Rome in that package. He wasn't the first Christian in Rome, of course, correct. And the Christians in Rome were already Goyish Christians, so to speak, unlike the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. So that could have been a kind of but what I'm saying is not about Jesus. It's about the universalism that at some point became associated with Christianity. As opposed to Rabbi Akiva, which represents the Torah Shebal Peh, which represents the continuation of the oral Torah, as opposed to either the written Torah as the Dead Sea Scroll, Metatron, as like Rachel Elior's version, or Greek philosophy, or the Christian universalism, and that's basically my 55 minutes on the four that entered into Pardes. And the bottom line is that these figures are influential, especially Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, who the Gemara takes great pains. The Gemara is very conflicted of what to say about Acher, because his Torah is considered like sacred. What we have today, we wouldn't have necessarily without him, yet he was a heretic. So the Gemara goes at great length to say they didn't want to punish him, but they could not punish him to get him into heaven eventually. And how could Rabbi Meir accept teachings from a heretic? And the answer is he was mature and he knew how to differentiate between the fruit and the chaff, so to speak.
Yasher Koach.